Okay, so the first entity we'll be talking about is the psoriasiform reaction pattern, and we'll be describing the relevant features in each of the major reaction patterns to give you a quick overview. And we won't focus so much on the specific diagnoses and relevant features. And I'll present prototypic examples from each of the major reaction patterns. I'll also introduce a systematic approach to describing pathology that starts from the top and works your way down to the deepest level of the biopsy and begins with an identification of the type of specimen. So this is a punch biopsy, and on low power we can appreciate parakeratosis of the, as you can see, the retention of nuclei in the stratum corneum, and its confluent parakeratosis. In some foci, hopefully you can appreciate that there are granulocytes or polymorphonuclear leukocytes or neutrophils in the stratum corneum. We'll call that an intracorneal pustule. The other feature that's notable is the diminished or absent granular layer. So there's hypogranulosis. So the granular layer is diminished, and this is typical underneath parakeratosis. The epidermis is regularly acanthotic, so there's regular epidermal acanthosis or regular epidermal hyperplasia, meaning that the reedy pegs are roughly of the same length, and that's in contrast to irregular epidermal acanthosis, where they're of different lengths. Another feature for this pattern is the presence of some degree of spongiosis, and we have some spongiosis here evidenced by an increase in the white spaces between the keratinocytes. It's almost as if they're stretched apart to the point where you can appreciate the spinous processes between each of the keratinocytes. I want to introduce the structure called the suprapapillary plate, which is the portion of the epidermis that sits above the papillary dermis. And in this entity, it's thinned. And then in the papillary dermis, you have dilated blood vessels that are congested. And then you have a patchy kind of perivascular and interstitial lymphocytic infiltrate. This happens to be an example of psoriasis, which is the prototype for the psoriasiform reaction pattern. Next, we move on to interface reaction patterns. There are two types. There's lichenoid and there's vacuolar. You always want to qualify your interface reaction pattern with either lichenoid or vacuolar interface reaction pattern. And this is a punch biopsy including superficial subcutis. There is orthohyperkeratosis. The granular layer is thickened, so there's hypergranulosis. The epidermis is irregularly acanthotic, and the reedy pegs have the distinctive quality of being thinned, and in some areas might be described as sawtoothed in appearance. There is a heavy lichenoid or band-like, predominantly lymphocytic infiltrate along the dermal-epidermal junction. There is basal vacuolization of the epidermis. So the basal epidermis shows white spaces around the keratinocytes, which represents vacuoles forming as a result of this lichenoid interface infiltrate. Concomitant with that, we can appreciate bottom-heavy cytoids. I'm going to point these out. These are colloid bodies or savat bodies, and they're usually in this entity at the base of the epidermis, or sometimes they drop down into the superficial dermis as well. And as we move along, you'll see more of these apoptotic keratinocytes or savat bodies. You can see them here, and I'll point them out with my arrow as we move across. Okay, so that's another feature of interface. And then one last thing I want to point out is the melanin incontinence. So there are macrophages in the superficial dermis that engulf melanin pigment that gets released from the overlying epidermis as a result of this interface insult and engulf those melanin granules. And so you can see melanophages in the papillary dermis, and we call that melanin incontinence, another feature of that interface pattern. So this happens to be lichen planus. And I want to point out a unique feature of lichen planus, these cleftings. Sometimes the basal vacuolization is so severe that you'll have confluence of the vacuoles into a cleft, a subepidermal cleft, and these are called Max Joseph spaces, and they're very typical for lichen planus. Max Joseph spaces. This is an example of the interface, of the vacuolar interface reaction pattern. So we have a shape biopsy here. We have a little bit of basket weave hyperkeratosis, and then we have an interface reaction characterized by intense basal layer vacuolization in the epidermis with scattered apoptotic keratinocytes. And you can see that the infiltrate along the dermal-epidermal junction is much more diminished in terms of its density. It's very patchy. There are lymphocytes in the epidermis, and they're directly associated with keratinocyte apoptosis. We call that satellite cell necrosis, which is very typical for this entity, graft versus host disease. So these are apoptotic keratinocytes. We have an intimate association between lymphocytes and keratinocytes in multiple foci like these. So this is a vacuolar reaction with basal layer vacuolization, apoptotic keratinocytes, and we don't have that dense lichenoid inflammation, but we have more of this perivascular and interstitial inflammatory infiltrate composed of mostly lymphocytes with admixed histiocytes. And what's one striking feature that I want to highlight is this is an acrosyringium. It's an eccrine duct that's winding its way up through the epidermis. And you can see that the vacuolar inflammation is involving this acrosyringeal structure with apoptotic keratinocytes as well. And that's a distinctive feature for graft versus host disease. So more of that vacuolar degeneration of the basal epidermis. Now let's move on to the spongiotic reaction pattern. And when you're evaluating the spongiotic reaction pattern, the key thing you want to pay attention to is where's the vesicle or the blister or the cleft situated? What level of the epidermis? Is it intracorneal, subcorneal, intragranular, intraepidermal, or subepidermal? And what is the predominant cellular infiltrate or composition of that blister or vesicle? In this example, we have a punch biopsy to the superficial subcutis. We have mostly basket weave stratum corneum, and the epidermis seems to be of reasonable normal thickness. And there is a subepidermal split, cleft, or vesicle. And it seems to be comprised of neutrophils mostly. So you can see that this cleft is composed of predominantly neutrophils. You can see these are polymorphonuclear leukocytes, mostly neutrophils. So this is a neutrophil-rich subepidermal cleft. And this happened to be a case of linear IgA bullous dermatosis, which was confirmed on a direct immunofluorescence analysis of the tissue. Another example from the spongiotic reaction pattern. Here we have a shape biopsy, we have basket weave hyperkeratosis, and involving multiple dermapapillae, we have subepidermal vesicles that are stuffed with neutrophils. Okay, so you can see that this is a subepidermal cleft that's neutrophil rich. So neutrophil rich subepidermal cleft. This is what we call neutrophilic papillitis because it's so distinctly limited to the papillae to the portion of the epidermis directly overlying the dermal papillae. So it's called neutrophilic papillitis, and this happens to be an example of dermatitis epidemiformis, but once again, the spongiotic vesicle is forming in a subepidermal zone and is comprised of neutrophils. Moving on to the granulomatous reaction pattern. Here we have a punch biopsy down to the superficial subcutis, and we have basket weave stratum corneum. Epidermis may be as mildly atrophic with in some areas, but mostly of normal thickness. And then we have these nodular aggregates in the superficial to mid-dermis. And these nodules are composed of these cells that have abundant eosinophilic cytoplasm. They have vesicular nuclei, prominent nucleoli, and they're clustered together. These are epithelioid histiocytes. And on the fringe of these collections of these epithelioid histiocytes are these dark blue round cells. These are lymphocytes on the periphery. So each of these nodules has the exact same structure. There are no neutrophils, there's no necrosis, or there's no necrotizing change associated with these structures. These are called granulomas. And again, they're comprised of epithelioid histiocytes because they look like epithelial cells. They're non-necrotizing granulomas. This is an example of sarcoid. And these are granulomas. Another example of the granulomatous reaction pattern, this is an excision specimen. And we know it's an excision specimen because we're looking at a fairly big piece of tissue, and it's inked. Okay? You can see that there's brown ink, or there's a brownish discoloration of the edge of the edges of the specimen, which corresponds to inking that's typically done in excision specimens. So the epidermis has there's some papillomatosis of the epidermis. There's focal ulceration right there with some inflamed hyperkeratotic serum crust. There's quite a bit of fibrosis indicative of post-procedural or post-biopsy related reparative or healing skin change. But I want to draw your attention to these nodular aggregates of varying size throughout the dermis. If we go in on higher power, I wanted to show you what these are comprised of. These are multinucleated giant cells with multiple nuclei, and they have these blue-gray material that they've engulfed in their cytoplasms. So whenever you see epithelioid histiocytes or multinucleated giant cells like this, these cells exist to clean up debris. They clean up the tissue, and they ingest exogenous and endogenous foreign body material. And these are called foreign body giant cells, foreign body multinucleated giant cells. So this is all degenerative suture material that's being engulfed and broken down, and then you can see the rim of lymphocytes at the periphery of this foreign body granuloma. And as you look throughout the tissue, you see these granulomas of varying sizes as well. So that's another example of the granulomatous reaction pattern. Moving on to the vasculopathic reaction pattern, I have one example here to share. This is a punch biopsy, including epidermis and dermis mostly. And starting from the top, we have compact orthohypokeratosis. This looks like we are on an acral site because I have a nice clear stratum lucidum. And there's some mild papillomatosis of the epidermis. You can see that the epidermis, though, beneath the stratum corneum kind of has a pale pink quality to it, and you've lost all evidence of cellular detail. Kind of, you have this homogeneous pink coloration, and we call this necrosis. So the epidermis is necrotic. There's full thickness necrosis of the epidermis, and there's a blister beneath that, and then you have secondary re-epithelialization of the epidermis on the floor of this blister. But to draw your attention to the dermis, there is a perivascular process and a vascular process that's ongoing, that's afflicting the vessels in the superficial, mid-dermis, as well as in the deeper aspects of the dermis. Okay, not every vessel is involved, but they're involved to varying extents. So if we go up here, you'll see that the blood vessels have lost all of their detail. And right next to this vessel here that's completely destroyed, you can see that you just no longer appreciate the lumen of the vessel, the endothelium is no more evident, and you have this fuzzy pink material that's depositing in the vessel wall. We call this fibrinoid necrosis, completely infiltrated by neutrophils, and there's a lot of cellular cytoclastic debris. And then right next to it, you have a vessel that's relatively intact for comparison. So this is what a leukocytoclastic vasculitis looks like. And let's move along, and you look around and you see more vessels that are variably or involved to varying extents. This vessel has lots of neutrophils in the perivascular space, in the lumen, and in the wall of the vessel. You kind of have that fuzzy pink fibrinoid necrosis of the vascular wall. Same thing here. You've lost the endothelial cell detail, and the lumen is completely obliterated. You have fibrinoid necrosis of the wall, infiltration with neutrophils. And in some foci, you'll see extravasation of red blood cells, like here. You have distinct red blood cells in the perivascular space. So this is an example of a leukocytoclastic vasculitis, and this is the vasculopathic reaction pattern. The next thing we'll cover is, I just wanted to show kind of scabies infestation, because I think for mite-like infestations of the skin that kind of burrow through the stratum corneum, paying attention to all levels of the skin sections is important. So this is a punch biopsy specimen, and if we can see that the stratum corneum looks like it's basket weave stratum corneum, epidermis looks to be reasonable thickness. But in this focus here, you can see evidence of some parakeratosis associated with some structures that don't look like they belong. Same thing there. You can see these curly, pink, strandy material that looks like a pigtail. And this is evidence of this scabies mite moving through the stratum corneum. And you can see the changes that it causes to the structure of the stratum corneum as a result. You can see the basket weave stratum corneum beneath that focus. Okay, and then you look beneath in the dermis, and you can see the density of the inflammatory infiltrate associated with that infestation of scabies. You have a dense, in this section is really nicely organized, superficial and mid-dermal, perivascular, and in some areas even nodular infiltrate comprised of lymphocytes, histiocytes, and lots of eosinophils. Hopefully you can appreciate the bright red cells with granules in their cytoplasm, so lots of eosinophils in the background. So this pattern, perivascular, interstitial, lymphohistiocytic with eosinophils. And by the way, there are also plasma cells in here. I'd love to point those out. These are plasma cells. Is typical for an insect bite-like reaction. So this is a hypersensitivity reaction of the body to the mite, to the scabies infestation in this person. And I'll show another example just to show the different morphologies of the mite. This is another example, again, in the stratum corneum. You know, on low power, this might look like a horn cyst, but there are no other horn cysts, and you look closely at it, and you can see this spinous structures coming off the ectoskeleton of the mite and the internal structure of the mite as well. So this is another example of scabies infestation. I'd like to show an example of a deposition disorder. So this is a very fragmented specimen, so forgive me for showing this, but I really like this example. Even though we don't see epidermis, these are fragments from the dermis. And there's this pale pink material that I hope you can distinguish from the adjacent collagen bundles, which are pale pink. Excuse me, which are dark pink. The collagen bundles are dark pink, and the material that's depositing is this sort of wispy pale pink material that looks like cotton candy. Very wispy and strandy. You can see how wispy and strandy it is. So this is an example of a gouty tophus, and the pale pink material is gout. And it's fringed by these epithelial histocytes that are sort of walling off these deposits because they don't belong, you know, in the extracellular tissue. So once again, your histiocytes or your macrophages and your multinucleated giant cells are doing their job of walling off this material. So this is what gout looks like in the skin. Pale pink, cotton candy-like deposits, and important to be able to distinguish them from the dark pink collagen bundles. Another entity that deposits in the skin, not too uncommonly, is this purplish granular clumpy material in this shave biopsy. This is an example of what calcium looks like. It tends to be deeply violaceous or purple in color. And that's what it can look like. Come here.
Hey, me.
Great. I was recording, but now I have to stop, so let's see.
Sorry.
That's okay.
I let you go.
No, I've already stopped now, so don't let me go.
I tried to call you so much.
Yeah. Okay.
I didn't know that, you know.
I know. It's okay. I'll do another section. Anyway, it's probably better that it's